Most people grow up with a very simple idea of business. A good business makes money. That sounds obvious. Sell something, earn more than you spend, keep the difference. That is how normal businesses survive. So when people hear that a company is losing hundreds of millions of dollars but it bows at sometimes even billions, but is still valued like a future empire, it sounds insane. How can a company lose money for years and still be called successful? How can investors look at red numbers and say, this is worth more? And why does a normal business owner have to worry about profit immediately, while a giant tech company can burn cash for years and still be treated like a winner? That difference is not just a business detail, it is one of the biggest shifts in how the modern economy works, because there are really two completely different business games being played. And once you see that, a lot of things suddenly make sense. On one side, you have the traditional business game. On the other side, you have the scale game. From the outside, they can look similar. Both have customers, both hire workers, both spend money, both try to grow, but underneath, they are judged by completely different rules. And that is why so many people talk past each other when they argue about what makes a business good. Samoan Shalberdian, Octiaus. Let's start with the traditional business. This is the world of mechanics, plumbers, cafes, tradies, builders, local shops, small agencies, and many self-employed businesses. In that world, profit is not just important, it is proof that the machine works. Why? Because most traditional businesses are tied closely to effort, labor, materials, and time. If you want more revenue, you usually need one of a few things: more customers, more hours, more staff, more equipment, or more locations, and every one of those costs real money right now. That means if the business is not making profit, pressure builds almost immediately. You still have rent, you still have wages, you still have bills, you still have tax, you still have repairs, you still have slow weeks. The business cannot survive on a story about the future. It has to survive on cash coming in now. That is why someone who built their life in that world often sees profit as the most important thing. Because in that world it usually is. If the business is not making money, then it is fragile. And if it stays fragile too long, it dies. Now compare that to the second game, the scale game. This is where the logic changes. A scalable company is not always judged mainly by current profit. It is often judged by what it could become if it wins. That is the shift. Investors are not always asking, how much money does this make right now? Sometimes they are asking something much bigger. If this becomes the default platform, if it becomes the place everyone goes, if it dominates the category, how valuable will that position be later? That means losses are not always seen as failure. Sometimes they are seen as fuel. The company might be spending money to grow faster than competitors. It might be spending to attract users, spending to become a habit, spending to build brand awareness, spending to lock in a network, spending to own attention, spending to create a position that becomes very hard to replace. In that case, investors are not just funding losses, they are funding an attempt to capture future power. So the question changes from, is it profitable now? To, is the money being burned to build something that could become dominant later? That is a completely different lens. This is where valuation comes in. Profit tells you what a business earns now. Valuation tells you what people believe the business might be worth in the future. And in some industries, future belief becomes more powerful than present earnings. Because if people think a company could become the default app, the default platform, the default marketplace, or the default infrastructure of an industry, they may value it based on that future possibility. That is why a company can look weak from one angle and incredibly valuable from another. One person sees losses and says, this isn't working. Another person sees the same losses and says, this company is buying territory. And that sounds abstract until you realize what modern investors are often really paying for. Not current profits, but future control. Control of users, control of data, control of distribution, control of habit, control of the place where transactions happen. And once a company controls that, profit can sometimes come later. Amazon is probably one of the clearest examples of this idea. For years, Amazon was famous for making very little profit relative to its size. To some people, that looked like weakness, but Amazon was doing something much more important. It was expanding infrastructure, building warehouses, improving logistics, lowering delivery friction, training customers to expect convenience, creating loyalty, making itself the place people instinctively checked first. In other words, it was not just trying to make money on each transaction, it was trying to become the system. And once you become the system, you gain power. You gain repeat traffic, you gain economies of scale, you gain negotiating leverage, you gain brand habit. You gain the ability to expand into other categories. So while a small business owner might reasonably ask, why are they not focused on profit? The investor question was different. Are they building a machine that will become incredibly hard to compete against later? That is why the company could look expensive before it looked traditionally efficient, because investors believe the future position would matter more than the current margin. Uber is another useful example because it shows the dream and the risk of this model. Uber lost huge amounts of money while expanding. Why would investors tolerate that? Because the bet was not just on taxi rides, the bet was on becoming the default transport layer in people's lives. Open the app. Get a car. No cash. No calling. No uncertainty. That convenience is powerful. The theory was that if Uber became the dominant habit, then later it could improve economics through scale, efficiency, pricing power, routing, cross-selling, memberships, food delivery, and network density. Whether every part of that dream works perfectly is a separate question, but the point is that investors were not just looking at present profit and saying, this is great. They were looking at future position and saying, if this works, this could be huge. That is how a company can keep attracting capital even while losses are piling up. Because the real asset is not the current income statement. It is the possibility of future dominance. Now, to be fair, traditional business owners are not stupid for rejecting this logic. A lot of the time they are protecting themselves from fantasy. Because most businesses are not Amazon. Most businesses are not Uber. Most businesses do not become dominant platforms. Most businesses do not have real network effects. Most businesses do not get more powerful just because more people join. And that is where a lot of founders get trapped. They hear startup language and think it means profit no longer matters. They think burning money sounds sophisticated. They think growth by itself is enough. But growth is only valuable if it is building something that becomes stronger, harder to replace, or cheaper to operate as it grows. If not, then you are not building an empire. You are just spending money. That is the dangerous misunderstanding. This is the most important distinction in the whole topic. There is a huge difference between burning money with purpose and bleeding money without purpose. Burning money with purpose means each dollar lost is doing something valuable. It is increasing retention, increasing market share, improving product quality, building infrastructure, making the product harder to compete with, reducing future customer acquisition cost, creating habit, creating switching costs, creating network effects. Bleeding money without purpose is different. That is when the company is losing money, but nothing meaningful is improving underneath. Customers are not becoming more loyal, margins are not getting better, the product is not becoming stronger, the business is not becoming defensible, there is no real moat forming. That kind of company can look exciting from the outside for a while, but underneath, it is hollow. And eventually investors start asking the hard question, if we stop funding losses, is there actually a real business here? That is the moment truth arrives. So if you are building something, especially software, the real question is not, should I care about profit or valuation? The real question is, what kind of machine am I building? Here is a simple framework. A business is stronger if it has more of these. First, it solves a real problem that many people have. Second, it can serve more users without costs rising at the same speed. Third, users become more likely to stay over time. Fourth, the product becomes more useful, more trusted, or harder to replace as it grows. Fifth, there is a believable path to turning scale into profit later. That last part matters a lot, because we'll monetize later is not a strategy by itself. Later only matters if there is a real reason profit becomes easier in the future. Maybe customer acquisition gets cheaper, maybe infrastructure costs spread across more users, maybe retention improves, maybe you can introduce subscriptions, maybe you own the workflow, and can expand into adjacent products. But there has to be a real mechanism. Hope is not a mechanism. This is also why software is so attractive compared with many normal businesses. A normal business often sells effort. Software can sell a system. If you build software once, in the best cases, you can sell it many times. That does not mean software is easy. It usually is not. But it does mean the upside can be very different. You are no longer just asking, can I make money from each job? You are asking, Can I build a system that keeps working even when I am not personally doing each piece of work? That is where valuation starts to make more sense, because investors are often looking for systems that can expand far beyond the founder's labor, not just a good business, a scalable engine. Because investors are often looking for systems that can expand far beyond the founder's labor. So, is profit the most important thing in a business? In one world, yes. If you are running a traditional business, profit is oxygen. Without it, you suffocate. But in another world, the scale world, early profit may not be the main point, because the real goal is to build a position so strong that profit later becomes enormous. That is why billion-dollar companies can lose money for years, not because profit does not matter, but because investors believe temporary losses might be buying future control. Sometimes that belief is right, sometimes it is wildly wrong, and that is the part people miss. The lesson is not, ignore profit. The lesson is, you can delay profit only if the money you are losing is building something powerful enough to justify it. So the real question is not profit or valuation. It is, are you building a small cash machine for today, or a powerful system that could control something important tomorrow? Because once you know which game you are in, business starts making a lot more sense.